Library of Alexandria. What was lost, what was real, and what became legend. Asleep in class, the city where the world came to read. Alexandria began as a city of ambition before it became a city of memory. It stood on the Egyptian coast, where the Mediterranean met the Nile's wider world, facing the sea with harbors, ships, warehouses, temples, palaces, and streets laid out with deliberate confidence. Founded by Alexander the Great and developed under the Ptolemies, it became one of the most important cities of the Hellenistic age, a place where Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, Near Eastern, and Mediterranean traditions met in the movement of people, goods, languages, and ideas. The city was not ancient in the same way that Memphis or Thebes was ancient. It was planned, political, and new, a royal city built to face outward. Its rulers understood that power could be made not only through armies and grain, but through knowledge. They wanted Alexandria to be more than a port. They wanted it to be a capital of learning, a place where the written inheritance of the Greek-speaking world and the wider world could be gathered, organized, corrected, translated, and preserved under royal patronage. At the center of this intellectual ambition stood the famous Library of Alexandria. But the word library can mislead if we imagine a single modern building with quiet aisles and labeled shelves. The library was part of a larger scholarly institution connected with the Mouseion, a sanctuary and research community dedicated to the Muses. It belonged to a world in which scholarship, royal display, religion, and administration were not cleanly separated. The Ptolemies supported scholars because learning brought prestige, but also because organized knowledge strengthened the image of kingship. The dream was enormous. Alexandria would gather texts from across the Greek world and beyond. It would collect poetry, drama, philosophy, history, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, geography, law, and technical writing. It would compare different versions of old works and decide which readings were best. It would create catalogues and systems of reference. It would make the city a place where a scholar could consult more texts than any private person could ever own. This was not merely storage. It was intellectual centralization. The library belonged to an age after Alexander's conquests, when Greek language and culture spread across territories stretching from the eastern Mediterranean into Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and farther east. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt was one of several successor kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's death. These kingdoms competed with armies, alliances, marriages, monuments, coinage, and patronage. To sponsor the greatest collection of books in the world was to compete in another register. It said that Alexandria was not only wealthy, but civilized, learned, and central. The physical city helped make that claim believable. Alexandria's harbors received ships from many directions. The island of Pharos, later famous for its lighthouse, helped shape the maritime identity of the city. Warehouses and docks connected sea trade to royal administration. The Nile linked Alexandria to the agricultural wealth of Egypt, while the Mediterranean connected it to the Greek islands, Asia Minor, the Levant, and beyond. Books could move along the same routes as grain, wine, papyrus, metals, and luxury goods. Papyrus was especially important. Egypt was one of the great sources of papyrus writing material, made from the plant that grew in the Nile environment. A library of scrolls required not just authors and collectors, but a material economy of sheets, rolls, ink, cases, labels, shelves, and scribes. The Ptolemies ruled a land that could produce the writing material on which much of the ancient book trade depended. This gave Alexandria a practical advantage in the world of texts. The story that later writers told about the library often included aggressive collecting. Ships entering Alexandria were supposedly searched for books, which could be copied by royal scribes before being returned, sometimes with the copy returned and the original kept. Whether every detail of such stories is reliable is less important than what they express. The reputation of Alexandria as a city determined to possess texts. It wanted not a modest collection, but a universal one, or at least the appearance of universality. That desire for universality was never simple. Ancient texts existed in multiple copies, and copies could differ. A famous poem might circulate in several versions, with lines added, omitted, rearranged, or corrupted by generations of transmission. To collect texts was therefore to confront variation. Alexandrian scholars did not merely pile scrolls together. They compared them. They marked doubtful lines. They studied language, meter, vocabulary, and usage. They helped invent habits of textual criticism that would shape scholarship for centuries. The library's fame has grown partly because it sits at the meeting point of knowledge and loss. People imagine it as a place where everything known to antiquity was stored, and then everything was destroyed in a single disaster. That image is powerful, but it is too simple. The real library was great, but not omniscient. Its destruction was probably not one clean event. Its decline unfolded across political change, war, neglect, and the shifting fortunes of Alexandria itself. The legend is dramatic. The history is more interesting. To understand the library, it helps to picture not only flames, but ordinary scholarly work. A man unrolls a papyrus and weighs one reading of Homer against another. A geographer calculates distances from reports brought by travelers. A mathematician demonstrates a proof in a shaded court. A poet studies older poetry before writing new verse. A cataloguer classifies authors by genre and title. A royal official asks whether the collection reflects the greatness of the king. These are quieter images than burning shelves, but they bring the institution closer to life. Alexandria became a city where the written past could be handled, examined, revised, and placed in order. That does not mean it was open to everyone. It was a royal institution, supported by power and shaped by elite culture. Many people who lived in Alexandria would never have entered its scholarly spaces. Sailors, bakers, servants, dockworkers, farmers, soldiers, and traders made the city function around it. The library's greatness depended on them too, even if its records rarely honored them. The city where the world came to read was therefore also the city where the world came to trade, argue, govern, worship, and compete. The library was not floating above history. It was embedded in politics, money, empire, language, and human ambition. Its shelves held scrolls, but its meaning came from the larger city that made such shelves possible. Alexandria wanted to gather the world in writing. For a time, it came closer than any city before it. Scrolls, scholars, and the Mouseion. The Library of Alexandria was closely tied to the Mouseion, whose name means a place of the muses. The modern word museum comes from that older idea, but the Alexandrian Mouseion was not a public museum in the modern sense. It was closer to a royal research institute, a community of scholars supported by the king, with spaces for study, discussion, dining, writing, and perhaps teaching. It gave scholars time, resources, and proximity to books. In return, they gave the city prestige and the dynasty intellectual authority. The scholars who worked in Alexandria were not all doing the same kind of work. Some studied poetry. Some studied grammar and language. Some worked on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, philosophy, or history. Some were editors and catalogers. Others wrote new works that drew on the immense collection around them. The institution was famous not only because it stored texts, but because it gathered specialists who could use them. A library without readers is a warehouse. Alexandria wanted a working mind around its scrolls. Among the most important achievements associated with Alexandrian scholarship was the careful study of older literature, especially Homer. The Homeric poems were already ancient to the scholars who studied them. They had been copied, recited, and transmitted through many generations. Alexandrian editors such as Xenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace became famous for comparing manuscripts, marking lines, and trying to establish authoritative texts. Their work may sound narrow, but it changed how later cultures treated inherited literature. To edit Homer in Alexandria was not simply to correct spelling. It was to ask what counted as the real text. When different copies disagreed, which version should stand? Was a line genuine or added later? Did a rare word belong to an older dialect, a poetic convention, or a scribal mistake? Such questions required memory, comparison, judgment, and a confidence that texts could be improved through disciplined criticism. The ancient editor was not a passive guardian. He was an active interpreter of tradition. Callimachus, one of the great literary figures associated with Alexandria, is linked with the Ptolemies, a vast catalogue of authors and works. The Ptolemies itself survives only in fragments and references, but its reputation matters. It suggests that the library required systems of organization. A collection on this scale could not be useful if no one knew what it contained. Cataloging was an intellectual technology. It turned abundance into access, and access into power. The scroll format shaped the experience of reading. Ancient books were usually papyrus rolls, not bound codices with pages. A reader unrolled with one hand and rolled up with the other, moving through columns of text. A long work might require several rolls. Labels helped identify contents. Scrolls could be stored in containers, shelves, or cabinets. They were vulnerable to moisture, insects, fire, wear, and careless handling. A library of scrolls needed constant care, copying, and replacement. The survival of a text depended on copying. No ancient scroll lasted forever. If a work was valued, it had to be recopied before the material failed. This means that preservation was never passive. Every generation made choices, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by neglect. A famous text might survive because many copies existed. A marginal work might vanish because no one chose to copy it. The library's collection was enormous, but even Alexandria could not overcome the basic fragility of ancient writing materials. Scholars at the Mouseion lived within royal patronage. This gave them support, but also placed them near power. The Ptolemies could attract talent by offering stipends, housing, food, status, and access to books. Such support allowed deep intellectual work, but it also meant that scholarship was tied to the fortunes of the court. A king who valued the institution could enrich it. Political instability, budget strain, or changing priorities could weaken it. Knowledge had a palace roof over it, and palace roofs depend on rulers. Mathematics and science also found a home in Alexandria's learned world. Euclid, whose Elements became one of the most influential mathematical texts ever written, is associated with Alexandria, though details of his life are sparse. Eratosthenes, who served as chief librarian according to tradition, calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable insight by comparing shadows and distances. Herophilus and Erasistratus were associated with important anatomical and medical work in the broader Alexandrian environment. These names remind us that the city's learning was not only literary. Eratosthenes is especially fitting for the imagination of Alexandria. He measured the earth from a city of books and reports. He needed geometry, observation, and information about distance between places. His work shows the connection between text, travel, administration, and mathematical reasoning. The library could collect accounts from many regions, but scholarship turned collected information into structured knowledge. Alexandria was at its best when it transformed scattered data into a wider view of the world. The city's scholars also worked with language at a deep level. They studied grammar, rare words, accents, pronunciation, and literary categories. To modern readers, this can seem dry, but in the ancient world such work helped preserve and interpret texts across changing dialects and centuries. A scholar who explained an obscure Homeric word was helping later readers cross time. A grammarian who classified forms of speech was organizing language itself. These labors became part of the foundation of later education. The library also participated in translation. The most famous associated tradition is the Greek translation of Jewish scriptures, known as the Septuagint, connected by legend with Ptolemaic Alexandria. The details of the story are debated, but the broader fact is clear. Alexandria was a multilingual, multicultural city where translation mattered. Texts did not live in one language only. They crossed borders, and when they did, they changed the intellectual world of new readers. It would be easy to romanticize the scholars as pure servants of knowledge, untouched by competition. In reality, learned communities have rivalries, ambitions, jealousies, and reputations. Scholars argued over readings, theories, and interpretations. They sought patronage and status. They criticized predecessors and rivals. The library's greatness came not from perfect harmony, but from concentrated activity. A crowded intellectual world can be difficult, but difficulty can sharpen thought. The Mouseion and library together formed one of the earliest major models of state-supported research. They did not resemble a modern university exactly, and they were not founded on modern ideals of public education. Yet, they showed that rulers could sponsor knowledge as a permanent institution. They showed that books, scholars, money, and organized space could create a new kind of cultural power. The idea that knowledge should be gathered and studied in a dedicated place is one of Alexandria's lasting legacies. In the quiet rooms of the Mouseion, the ancient world learned to look at its own inheritance with unusual intensity. Poems became objects of analysis. Measurements became arguments. Names became entries in catalogues. Scrolls became witnesses to earlier voices. The scholars of Alexandria did not save everything, and they did not know everything, but they made a decisive claim that the written past deserved organized attention. That claim still echoes wherever people build libraries, archives, laboratories, and schools. What the library actually was. The Library of Alexandria is often imagined as a single majestic building filled with every book in the ancient world. That image is beautiful, but the historical reality was probably more complicated. The library was part of a royal scholarly complex connected to the Mouseion and perhaps supplemented by other collections, including one later associated with the Serapeum. Its exact architecture is not securely known. Ancient descriptions are limited. Archaeology has not given us a complete floor plan, and later imagination has filled the gaps with marble halls and endless shelves. What we can say is that the library was a collection of scrolls supported by the Ptolemaic state and used by scholars in Alexandria. It was famous for its ambition to collect widely, especially Greek literature, but also texts from other traditions as they became available in Greek or through translation. It was not a public library in the modern civic sense. It was a royal and scholarly institution. Access was likely restricted to those connected with the court, the Mouseion, or learned circles. Its purpose was prestige, research, cultural competition, and intellectual control. The number of scrolls in the library is one of the most repeated and least certain details. Ancient and later sources give large figures, sometimes hundreds of thousands. But a scroll is not the same as a modern book. A single long work might fill multiple scrolls. Duplicates may have existed. Counting methods could vary. Some numbers may be rhetorical, meant to express greatness rather than inventory precision. The safest statement is that the collection was very large for its time and famous throughout antiquity, while exact totals remain uncertain. The library's collection policy reflected both curiosity and power. To acquire a text was to bring an author, a city, or a tradition into Alexandria's orbit. The Ptolemies wanted the best copies, not just any copies. Stories about seizing or copying books from ships, or borrowing official Athenian copies of tragedies, and keeping the originals, may contain exaggeration, but they show the reputation Alexandria acquired. It was a city that treated books as treasures worthy of royal maneuvering. The library was also not the only major library of the ancient world. Pergamum, for example, developed an important rival collection under the Attalid dynasty. Competition between Alexandria and Pergamum became part of the larger Hellenistic rivalry over culture and prestige. Libraries were not neutral storehouses in this context. They were monuments of royal identity. To build a great library was to say that one's city was a center of civilization. Papyrus shaped the library's life. Scrolls had to be produced, acquired, stored, repaired, and copied. A damaged roll might require replacement. A rare work might need careful duplication. Scribes had to write clearly and accurately. Scholars had to compare copies. A collection could grow, but it also demanded maintenance. The library was therefore an ongoing operation, not a completed object. Its survival required money, labor, management, and institutional continuity. The famous cataloging work associated with Callimachus suggests that the library became a place where knowledge had to be classified. Authors could be grouped by genre. Works could be listed, attributed, compared, and described. This mattered because ancient authorship could be uncertain. Texts circulated under famous names. Works could be misattributed. Titles varied. The library's scholars were not simply preserving literature. They were creating systems for deciding what literature was and how it should be known. One of the most important things the library actually did was stabilize texts. In a manuscript culture, every copy is a chance for change. A scribe can misread, omit, repeat, correct, alter, or misunderstand. Over time, different textual traditions emerge. Alexandrian scholars confronted this problem by comparing copies and marking doubtful passages. They developed signs and methods of criticism. Their additions influenced later transmission. The ancient texts we read today often passed, directly or indirectly, through scholarly traditions shaped by Alexandria. The library's relationship with Egyptian culture was complex. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek rulers of Egypt, and Alexandria was a Greek-speaking royal capital. Yet it stood in Egypt and depended on Egyptian resources, labor, temples, agriculture, and older intellectual traditions. The library's main surviving reputation is centered on Greek scholarship. But the city itself was multicultural. Egyptian priests, Greek scholars, Jewish translators, merchants, officials, and many other communities inhabited the same urban world, though not always equally or peacefully. The library was also part of a larger information system. The Ptolemaic state needed records, taxation, land surveys, shipping administration, military organization, and legal documentation. Scholarly collection and bureaucratic administration were not identical, but they grew in the same environment of written control. A kingdom that counted fields, grain, and taxes could also imagine counting authors and scrolls. Alexandria's intellectual order stood beside administrative order. The question of where the library was located is harder than popular images suggest. The main collection was associated with the royal quarter and the Mouseion. A secondary or daughter collection is often linked with the Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to Serapis. The distinction matters because later stories about destruction may refer to different places at different times. When people say the library burned, they may be compressing several institutions and centuries into one image. The Serapeum itself became important in later Alexandria, especially during the Roman and Christian periods. If it housed a daughter collection, then part of the Alexandrian library tradition survived outside the original royal complex. But the evidence is uneven. The great danger in telling the library's story is turning every uncertain reference into certainty. A careful history must keep the categories separate. The main library, the Mouseion, the Serapeum, the wider book culture of Alexandria, and the later legend of total destruction. The library was never a complete collection of all human knowledge. Many cultures transmitted knowledge orally. Many texts were never written down. Many written works never reached Alexandria. Many traditions existed outside Greek scholarly priorities. Even within the Greek world, the collection's completeness was an aspiration rather than a fact. But the aspiration itself was extraordinary. The Ptolemies imagined that knowledge could be gathered in one city, made searchable, corrected, and placed under royal guardianship. That idea has a double edge. On one hand, it created conditions for remarkable scholarship. On the other, it concentrated cultural memory in institutions vulnerable to politics, funding, war, and decay. A decentralized tradition may survive through many small copies spread widely. A centralized collection can become magnificent and fragile. Alexandria's power came from gathering texts together. Its legend of loss comes from the fear that gathering can make destruction feel absolute. What the library actually was then is more powerful than the myth in some ways. It was not a magical building that contained every vanished secret. It was a human institution, ambitious, selective, royal, scholarly, material, vulnerable, and historically situated. It depended on papyrus, scribes, ships, kings, catalogs, and readers. It held scrolls, but it also held procedures. Its true legacy is not only the quantity of works it stored, but the habits of inquiry it helped develop. The library's reality asks us to admire without exaggerating. It was one of the great intellectual institutions of antiquity. It attracted scholars, gathered texts, supported criticism, and gave Alexandria a lasting place in the history of knowledge. But it was not outside time. It rose because a particular dynasty, city, economy, and cultural moment supported it. It declined because institutions require continuity. The library was real, and because it was real, it was mortal. Fire, war, politics, and the problem of legend. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is one of the most famous losses in history, but also one of the most misunderstood. Popular memory often imagines a single night of fire, a final catastrophe in which the wisdom of the ancient world vanished all at once. The real story is less clear and more unsettling. The library was not destroyed by one simple event that everyone recorded in the same way. It seems to have declined through a series of political, military, institutional, and cultural disruptions spread across centuries. The first famous suspect is Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, during Caesar's involvement in the Alexandrian Civil War, fires set near the harbor destroyed ships and nearby structures. Ancient sources differ on what exactly burned. Some later accounts suggest that books or book warehouses were lost. Other evidence indicates that the Mouseion or scholarly institution may have continued afterward, at least in some form. Caesar's fire may have damaged part of Alexandria's book supply or storage facilities, but it probably did not erase the entire library, as later legend imagines. This uncertainty matters because it changes the story from disaster to process. If the library survived Caesar's fire, then its later decline must be explained by continuing change. Alexandria passed from Ptolemaic rule into Roman rule. The royal court that had founded and sustained the institution disappeared. Patronage changed. The political purpose of the library changed. A scholarly institution tied to a dynasty may lose strength when that dynasty ends, even if its buildings do not immediately burn. Under Roman rule, Alexandria remained an important city, but it was no longer the capital of an independent Ptolemaic kingdom competing for intellectual glory through royal patronage. Scholars still lived and worked there. The city still mattered, but the institutional context was different. A library can decline not only by flames, but by reduced funding, fewer acquisitions, loss of staff, political disorder, and the slow failure to copy aging texts. In manuscript culture, neglect is a form of destruction. Alexandria was also a city of conflict. Ethnic, religious, political, and social tensions could erupt violently. Roman emperors and governors had to manage a complex urban population. Riots, repression, and warfare damaged parts of the city at different times. The royal quarter, where the main library and Mouseion had likely been located, may have suffered in later Roman conflicts. By the 3rd century CE, especially amid imperial crises, warfare and urban damage may have further weakened whatever remained of the old scholarly infrastructure. Another famous episode concerns the Serapeum, destroyed in 391 CE after imperial policies against traditional pagan cults and local Christian pagan conflict. The Serapeum may have contained a daughter library or book collection at some earlier point, though the size and state of that collection by the late 4th century are debated. Its destruction became part of the broader legend of the library's end. But again, caution is needed. Destroying the Serapeum was a major event in Alexandria's religious history, yet it may not be identical with the destruction of the original Great Library. A later medieval story blamed the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, claiming that Caliph Omar ordered the books destroyed. Most modern scholars treat this story with deep skepticism. It appears in sources written long after the supposed event and fits too neatly into polemical storytelling. By the time Arab armies took Alexandria, the old Great Library was almost certainly already gone as a functioning institution. This legend tells us more about later anxieties and religious blame than about the library's actual end. The problem with the Library of Alexandria is that people want a villain. Caesar, Christians, Muslims, mobs, emperors, and neglect have all been made to stand in the firelight. But the historical evidence resists a single villain. Different collections may have been damaged at different times. The main library may have weakened before some famous destruction stories occurred. The Mouseion may have survived in altered form after one disaster and declined after another. The legend compresses a long institutional death into a single dramatic wound. This compression is emotionally powerful. A single burning library gives us a clean symbol of ignorance, destroying knowledge. It lets the past become a moral painting, books on one side, fire on the other. But history rarely stays that clean. Knowledge can be lost through budget cuts, political indifference, changing languages, fragile materials, war damage, religious transformation, administrative collapse, and simple failure to copy. A scroll does not need a bonfire to disappear. It only needs enough generations of neglect. The library's decline also reminds us that preservation depends on networks, not just buildings. A text survives when copies exist in multiple places, when readers value it, when institutions teach it, when scribes reproduce it, and when later cultures continue to use it. Some works that existed in Alexandria may have survived elsewhere. Some works lost from Alexandria may have vanished entirely. The library was important, but it was not the only path by which ancient texts reached the future. The myth of total loss sometimes leads people to imagine that the library held advanced scientific secrets that would have transformed the modern world if only they had survived. This is possible in the broad sense that many works were lost, including scientific, philosophical, historical, and literary writings. But the idea that all later progress was set back by one fire is not a careful historical claim. It is a modern fantasy about a single point where history could have been saved. Real intellectual history is more distributed more uneven, and more dependent on social conditions than that. What was truly lost is still enormous. Ancient authors known only by name once wrote works that no longer survive. Historians preserved fragments of older historians. Later writers quoted lines from poets whose books disappeared. Scientific treatises, local histories, dramas, commentaries, maps, catalogues, and technical manuals may have passed through Alexandrian collections and then vanished from the manuscript tradition. The loss is not imaginary. It is simply not measurable in the neat way legend wants. The library's story also became a mirror for later cultures. Each age sees its own fears in Alexandria. Scholars see the fragility of archives. Scientists see the vulnerability of inquiry. Religious polemicists see the danger of fanaticism. Secular moderns see the threat of ignorance. Librarians see preservation work. Digital cultures see the risk of data loss. The ancient library becomes a symbol large enough to hold many warnings, even when the historical details remain uncertain. A careful account does not weaken the tragedy. It deepens it. If the library had burned completely in one night, then the lesson would be simple: protect books from fire. But if it declined through war, neglect, political change, institutional fragility, and centuries of disruption, the lesson is harder. Knowledge needs more than heroic rescue at the last moment. It needs durable systems, repeated copying, social value, funding, peaceful conditions, and people trained to care. The Library of Alexandria may have died many deaths. Part of it may have burned near the harbor. Part of its institutional strength may have ended with the Ptolemies. Part of its collection may have been dispersed, damaged, neglected, or absorbed into other traditions. Part of its memory may have shifted to the Serapeum. Part of its legend may have been created by people living long after the original institution was gone. The uncertainty is not a failure of history. It is one of the most honest things history can offer. In the end, the question is not only who destroyed the library. The better question is how any civilization protects knowledge across time. Alexandria shows that collecting knowledge is easier than making it immortal. A king can fund scholars. A city can gather scrolls. Scribes can copy texts. Catalogues can organize abundance. But centuries are long, and institutions are mortal. Fire is dramatic, but time is patient. The library's end was likely not a single flame, but the slow disappearance of the conditions that made it possible. What Alexandria lost and what it left behind. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its shadow remains unusually bright. It survives not as a building we can enter, but as an idea people continue to return to whenever they think about knowledge, memory, ambition, and loss. The ancient scrolls are mostly gone. The shelves are gone. The scholars' rooms are gone. The royal patronage that sustained them is gone. Yet the library still feels present, because it represents one of humanity's earliest great attempts to gather the written world into an organized center. What Alexandria lost cannot be listed completely. That is part of the sorrow. We do not have an inventory of every vanished scroll. We do not know which works disappeared only there and which existed in copies elsewhere. We know from ancient references that many authors once wrote far more than survives today. Greek tragedy, comedy, history, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, geography, local chronicles, poetry, technical manuals, and commentaries all suffered losses across antiquity and the Middle Ages. Some of those losses may be connected to Alexandria. Many were part of the broader fragility of manuscript culture. The lost works matter because they would have changed the texture of the ancient world as we understand it. Imagine having more plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, more histories from local perspectives, more scientific treatises, more women's voices, more records from cultures filtered through Greek or Roman observers, more commentaries explaining how ancient scholars understood their own traditions. Each missing work is not just missing information. It is a missing angle of human experience. But Alexandria did not only lose, it also left methods. The scholarly habits developed there helped shape textual criticism, grammar, cataloging, literary scholarship, and scientific inquiry. Later scholars inherited not merely texts, but ways of handling texts. The idea that manuscripts should be compared, doubtful lines marked, authors classified, and knowledge organized did not end with the library. It traveled forward through educational traditions, commentaries, schools, and later libraries. The library also left a model of intellectual infrastructure. It showed that knowledge can be supported institutionally. A society can choose to fund scholars, gather books, maintain collections, and give time to inquiry. This may seem obvious now, but it was a profound development. The library made visible the idea that learning is not only an individual act. It can be built into a place, supported by resources, and given continuity across generations. That model influenced later dreams of universal knowledge. Roman libraries, monastic scriptoria, Islamic houses of wisdom, medieval universities, Renaissance humanist collections, national libraries, research institutes, archives, and digital databases all belong to a long history of organized memory. They are not direct copies of Alexandria in a simple line, but they share its ambition. Somewhere behind every great library is the old Alexandrian dream: gather, preserve, compare, and make available the works of the mind. The library's story also teaches humility. Even the greatest collection of antiquity could not guarantee its own survival. A civilization can be brilliant and still lose much of itself. It can produce scholars and still depend on politics. It can gather books and still fail to protect them forever. The loss of Alexandria is not proof that learning is futile. It is proof that learning requires care beyond the moment of creation. There is another lesson in the library's selectiveness. Alexandria preserved and studied what its culture valued most, especially Greek literature and scholarship. Other traditions were included unevenly, often through translation or elite interest. No archive is neutral. Every collection reflects choices, what to acquire, what to copy, what language to privilege, what subjects to honor, what names to record, and what ordinary lives to ignore. The dream of universal knowledge always meets the reality of human selection. For modern viewers, the library can be both inspiring and uncomfortable. It inspires because it shows a civilization taking books seriously. It troubles because it reminds us that access to knowledge was limited, controlled, and tied to royal power. The same institution that preserved texts also served dynastic prestige. The same city that welcomed scholars also rested on inequality, imperial wealth, and labor systems far beyond the reading rooms. The library was noble and political at once. The ancient scholars themselves probably did not imagine that they would become symbols of a lost golden age. They were doing difficult work in their own present. They corrected lines, argued over grammar, measured the earth, catalogued authors, taught students, wrote poems, and sought patronage. Their world had deadlines, rivalries, errors, and ordinary fatigue. The legend makes them distant. Their labor makes them human. In that humanity lies one of Alexandria's deepest gifts. The library reminds us that knowledge is made by people who know they are temporary. A scribe copies a text he did not write for a reader he will never meet. A cataloger orders scrolls for future hands. A scholar marks a doubtful passage because accuracy matters, even if no king notices. Preservation is an act of faith in strangers. The library was built on that faith, even when it was also built on royal ambition. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in the 21st century near the ancient city's shoreline, is not the old library returned from the dead. No modern building can restore the vanished scrolls, but its existence shows the continuing power of the Alexandrian image. People still want Alexandria to mean learning. They still want a library by the sea to answer the memory of loss with an act of renewal. The old dream has not disappeared. It has changed form. Alexandria's legacy also belongs to the digital age. Today, humanity stores knowledge in servers, clouds, databases, archives, scans, and networks. This can create the illusion that knowledge is safer than ever. But digital information has its own fragilities: hardware decay, format obsolescence, institutional failure, censorship, misinformation, corporate control, and the simple disappearance of neglected files. Alexandria warns that storage is not preservation unless care continues. The library's myth, for all its exaggerations, performs a useful emotional function. It makes people grieve for lost knowledge. That grief can be productive if it leads to better preservation, wider access, careful scholarship, and respect for archives. The danger comes when myth replaces history entirely. Then Alexandria becomes a fantasy of one perfect lost library instead of a real institution whose rise and decline can teach us more precise lessons. What Alexandria left behind is therefore not only a wound, but a responsibility. It asks each generation what it will save, how it will save it, who will be allowed to read it, and what systems will protect it after the first excitement fades. It asks whether knowledge will depend only on wealthy patrons or whether broader communities will defend it. It asks whether we will preserve only the famous or also the ordinary and fragile. The Library of Alexandria was never the whole mind of the ancient world. It was one brilliant center among many, magnificent and incomplete. Its loss was not the end of knowledge, but it was a great reminder that memory can be broken. Its legend survived because people recognize something terrifying in that break. We know that human beings can create wonders. We also know that wonders can vanish. And so the library remains with us, not as marble and papyrus, but as an image of a city reaching toward the impossible. A harbor full of ships, a royal quarter full of scrolls, a scholar bending over Homer, a mathematician thinking about the earth's curve, a cataloger writing names so they will not be lost, a shelf in a quiet room holding voices from far away. Then time, war, politics, neglect, and fire moving slowly through the centuries. What was lost at Alexandria cannot be restored, but what it left behind can still be honored. Every careful archive, every preserved manuscript, every public library, every honest citation, every act of translation, every teacher introducing an old text to a new student carries a small part of the Alexandrian promise. The promise is not that knowledge will never be lost. It is that human beings can keep choosing to remember.